good evening and or afternoon and or morning and or whatever time it is where you're watching us. Um, it's nice to welcome everyone to this sort of interesting event to mark the publication of Richard Gimel-Topolsky's new book, The Communism of Love. Um, just to do a short intro, I first met you, Richard, what was it, 2003 or 2002?
I can't remember, some thereabouts.
Yeah, at the Institute for Anarchist Studies, we're doing the Anarchist Tradition Conference in Vermont. And you're someone I've sort of known for years and years, and always really liked your work and writing, and have had the pleasure of sort of getting to sort of publish some of your books about radical politics, about Marxism, about precarity, about a whole range of fun things. Um, and I'm never sure how to do intros because so I'm so excited. Excellent. Okay, I'm never sure how to do intros because like I could like read off a list of like institutional things, but you know what? If you would care about those things, just go Google it. So that's Richard. I'm Steve. If you want to know that stuff, you can Google it. So I'll start with something else. So one of the things I thought about when I first read this book, Richard, is when I had the pleasure of getting to publish some of your earlier books. Whenever I would put anything on Twitter or Facebook, I would get sort of bombed by Twitter bots or maybe sort of right wing trolls going on about how like, oh man, this guy is such a communist. He's going to destroy Illinois. My first thought was, oh damn, there's going to be so many Twitter bots after this, which I'm sure you're absolutely thrilled by. But maybe to start with the sort of a basic question is, so a book about communism and love. Those are two words which I don't think we usually put together. So how did you end up there, and how are you, like, what are you getting to trying to explore the relationship between communism and love?
Well, I guess that is as good as any place to begin. And for people tuning in, we don't have any presentations planned. We're just going to have an open improvisation. So we'll just see where it goes. But this book was actually a book that I was afraid to write. It was scary for me to think about writing a book about love, because I'm trained in political theory and philosophy, and within those milieus, it's not something that is considered hard enough for political science or political analysis. It's considered soft in some literature. It is considered something that should be left to poetry and metaphysics, and only those who are willing to speak of God should touch it. And certainly it shouldn't be in any way connected with politics. So that was, for example, one of the major arguments that Hannah Arendt made when she reacted against James Baldwin, who wrote about love. And it seemed to me that I wanted to think about the materiality of love as a really concrete experience in the real lives of real people in the real world. I wanted to think about love not as some ineffable, metaphysical, godlike concept, but instead as a real experience that manifests in the material relations of human affairs, that matters to everyone on Earth. So I'm enough steeped in French critical theory, postmodern philosophy, to know that we should beware any kind of claims about universality. But it seems to me, at least, that the aspiration to love, if it isn't universal, it approaches universality as a basic aspiration of human beings everywhere. Then the question is, but what do people mean by it? I mean, it's one thing to say that everyone's for freedom. It's another thing to say, what do you mean by freedom? Is it the free market, right? You oppose dignity openly. They say, I'm against human dignity. But people do have different ways of defining what dignity means, what freedom means, what love means. So I wanted to think about what love was in a concrete and materialist way. Now, the way to do that is partially to read people who wrote about love, to think about love with those who have thought about love. So there's a chapter in this book that engages Plato's Symposium. There's a lot of this book that deals with Erich Fromm, Simone Weil, Emmanuel Levinas. It's a pretty exhausting book. I'm exhausted from this book. But when I think about communism, I do not think about communism in the way that Erich Fromm did in the 1950s. When he thought about communism, he thought about the SPSDF. He thought about the Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Foundation. And when I think about communism, I don't think about a form of government. I think about communism starting with Marx, who, when he was thinking of communism in his mid to late 20s, he was thinking about human relations. He was thinking about the ways that human beings relate to each other. And he was thinking about forms of life, not forms of government, right? He was thinking about forms of life. So if you look at when he was 26 years old, his Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, it begins with a kind of series of chapters that establish the political economy of Marx, Marx's political economy, the rent of land, the profit of capital, the wages of labor. But then, of course, the famous fourth part about estranged labor. And so early on for Marx, answering the question of why political economy matters, why did it matter to move from feudalism to the wage system, wage labor? Why does rent of land matter? What is profit of capital? When Marx wanted to answer the question of why political economy matters, he very quickly then turned to thinking about alienation, estranged labor, estrangement from one's labor, estrangement from products of labor, estrangement from other human beings, estrangement from oneself, estrangement from what it means to be a human, estrangement from species being, what it means to be a human being. So some people who engage Marx like to think wrongly that a focus on the question of human relationality in Marx is a mistake. But I find it very clearly traceable throughout the entirety of Marx's body of work, perhaps more than in the manuscripts of 1844 in Grundrisse, and in the whole sustained attention to the question of the Gemeinwesen, of the way that humans relate to each other. And in Grundrisse, Marx argued that exchange relations only begin at the border of the community. They don't have any business arranging human affairs inside of the community, but at the border of where one community meets another community, exchange relations take off. That's one of the major conclusions in Grundrisse. So I started to think about human relations as I was thinking at the same time about love. And I started to thinking about the truly alien and destructive force of exchange relations inside of the spaces of life that matter most to human beings. So to give everyone a couple of examples, I have two young children, and it's not like John Locke's two treatises of government, where in order to claim food, they have to mix their labor with nature. And because they've mixed their labor with the ground and the vegetable grows, they claim it as their own. If we took our babies and our toddlers and placed them in the forest with a copy of two treatises of government, they'd be dead in a day. What we do is we give them everything they need, not in exchange for labor. I would like them to clean up the mess that they make, but I'm not going to hold water and food hostage from my children and hang on to it in exchange for some labor or anything else. The logic of exchange relations has no business there. It has no business organizing the relationships that matter most to us. And if people can't find those within the context of their immediate family, as many people have pointed out rightly, like bell hooks and others, then in the friendships with colleagues and comrades that you make, the exchange relations are deeply problematic there. So I was thinking about the communism of the relations that matter most to human beings. And it seems to me that there is a necessary communism of love. That love, of course, we have to define love. We have to talk about what we mean by love, because like dignity and human freedom, we can't just assume everyone means the same thing. But the way I understand it is that the basic and sort of overarching point of why love and why communism is that I think that if you think a lot about love, you will see its communism. You will see the communism of love, and that the only way really not to see the communism of love is not to think about love. So one part of it is to say, look, if love is a near universal aspiration of human beings on Earth, whatever people mean by it and how differently it is defined, what if there is a necessary communism, or what Marx called a naturally arising communism in love relations? Isn't that the same thing as to say that a near universal human aspiration is communist? And I think that it is. I think that one of the things that love shows us is the universality of a communist aspiration.
If we go back for a second, I was struck by how you were saying that you were sort of slightly hesitant, maybe even afraid to write it, and which I could totally take on board in terms of reluctance to appear a bit absurd or sound like a silly hippie. But then I was thinking about where you ended up, which is, like why do it? And I think we got to there was your discussion about how revealing the sort of potential or the sort of communist nature of something that is so almost universal and omnipresent. If it would be a seasonal rom-com movie, which I'm sure is definitely your favorite, rather than Love Actually, you've just written Communism Actually. Have you ever seen that?
I haven't seen it, but I'm not above seeing it. I've seen plenty of rom-coms.
But then what I want to ask, following about it, is if we're up with the idea that so there's this communist potentiality that is nearly everywhere in various forms, relationships with children, with people in our everyday life, isn't it almost a question of what blocks that off or what limits that or sort of what shuts it down or encloses it?
Yes, I think very much. So one entry point is the one we've discussed, which is thinking a little bit about love and a little bit about communism. Another entry point would be thinking about capitalism. And because we know that when Marx defined communism in the German ideology as the real movement that abolishes the present state of things, he was talking about the the industrial capitalist reality of the world in that context of time. Um, he was talking about struggles against exploitation, expropriation, immiseration, disaffection, alienation. We mustn't forget. So another entry point or another way of answering, like what limits it or what suffocates or cuts off the oxygen for love, is to think about what is capitalism. And in the same way that I wouldn't reduce communism to uh, to the SPSDF like Eric Fromm does, or to just the economic sphere. Also, we should not think about capitalism as an economic system. It certainly must never be reduced to merely an economic system. Of course, capitalism, the logic of capital, can organize and does organize economic affairs, but it organizes far more than that. It organizes how we relate to other human beings in everyday life. And we see the limits of organizing life according to the logic of capital, especially sharply today, because we are talking in this way, partly because of a global pandemic. And there are limits to organizing social life according to the logic and economic affairs and everything else. But this is part of the reason why I think that not only Marx, but Eric Fromm and Herbert Marcuse and many others who I discuss in the book are really important, because they understand capitalism as certainly implicating what happens in terms of the market relations of the society and labor and production and commodification and the whole sort of apparatus, right? The whole machinery of production. But they also talk about the way that the kind of social relations that are acculturated in a society organized by the logic of capital. So one of the things that forecloses a lot of the space that we have to expand the love relations that contain an oppositional logic to the logic of exchange is that we are loving one another, or we are practicing love in capitalist societies that require us to relate to one another on an entirely different logic than the logic of love, on the logic instead of exchange. So this was one of the things that was confronted by Alexandra Kollontai in the first half of the 20th century. Alexandra Kollontai was thinking about how we could, first of all, deal with problems in the family, problems having to do with patriarchy, having to do with sexism, and the privatization of family life. There's these little islands that are hermetically sealed off, cut off from each other. And the affairs of the family are only the affairs of are only the concern of its members. So there were lots of problems there. But one of the things that Kollontai confronted as in the passage of the Russian Revolution was the question of, can we take the best approaches to healthy human relationality that we find between lovers or family members and friends? And can we create a social system that expands the organizational logic of those principles? Now, there's a lot of problems there because Kollontai ended up working for the Soviet Union, representing the Soviet Union on diplomatic missions. And if anyone should have known that the way to do that was not through the administrative apparatus of the state, it ought to have been Kollontai. But you know, she became a part of the of the institutional apparatus of the Soviet Union. But nonetheless, the problem is, in my view, that we have only limited spaces and times within which we can organize our lives according to different rules. But we can't do that all the time because we actually live in societies that tell us we can't. We need to go to work. We need to have money for groceries, right? So the main limiting force comes out of the history of capitalism, I think.
Hmm. It reminds me of, I think it's Hartnegger who make an argument at some point that it's in family life that is one of the only spaces where people get a sort of an experience of something resembling a sort of functional communality, and that that like as you're saying that relations are not dominated by exchange value, but you don't sort of ask your partner, can I get $5 for doing the dishes or something, and I'm thinking you hear of stories about I remember once reading a story about a father who attempted to manage his family using lean management techniques. He basically tried to do sort of like just-in-time management techniques to sort of organize the household, and it was somewhat catastrophic. Or sort of the idea of children who would try to like pay back their parents for the debt of being born. It's almost sort of like a completely unthinkable thought. And I was also I quite like the discussion around Jenny Marks, the Marks household. One, because I think it would actually make a nice sort of like sitcom. Trying to imagine like Thanksgiving dinner. Marks' daughter brings home Paul the Fudge. Like, oh, that's the rascal who wrote the right to be lazy. Get him out of here.
Right.
It would be a lot of fun. But the thing I like about it, aside from the joke aspect of it, is the way you talk about how behind any sort of functional relationship, and behind actually, I would say almost any sort of creative, caring person, is actually a relationship of love that actually sustains them. And so it's not so. Anytime you see sort of one person's name on a book or an album or almost anything, there's almost definitely a web of sort of like caring relationships that they're embedded in, which are to a large degree responsible for creating that possibility.
Yes. I mean, this is a really one of the aims of this book is to make some of the women appear who have been so integral to the history and the development of the theory and the politics that are often very egregiously still dominated by men. And I noticed in the wonderful book on Jenny and Karl Marx by Mary Gabriel called Love in Capital, which I think is really an excellent book, that Gabriel, like many others within the Marxist within contemporary Marxist literature, are trying to bring help to make Engels get the proper due. What he ought to, how much a part of the development of Marx's ideas was really connected to Frederick Engels, and I think that's right. And I'm glad that Gabriel and others have done that. But Jenny Marx, I think we need to appreciate how the materiality of love relations, how real that is, how it is so far away from a metaphysical and theological conception. You know, when in the Greco-Christian idea of agape, that concept of the Greco-Christian concept of love as agape, the highest form of love, is not philia. It's not love between humans. It's the love of God and God's love of humans. But we really have to look down and see how much the grounded materiality of love relations works and what it's responsible for. What does it do in the world? So with Jenny, it was just so clear because, and yet it has been totally overlooked, that the first books that Marx ever wrote were poetry. They were books of poetry titled The Books of Love, in multiple volumes that he wrote for Jenny Marx, um, and gave to her on Christmas in the year of their marriage. And they were together from such a young age. And he regarded her, and Engels regarded her, as an intellectual equal. And if anybody who's listening would like to go and look up the handwriting of Karl Marx, good luck reading a word of it. But Jenny was over his shoulder transcribing it. She was directly participatory in the development of not just the writing, but the thinking itself, right? I mean, she was there from the beginning until the end. And this has been attested to in many ways and places. Yet, even in Mary Gabriel's very beautiful book, Jenny appears almost like a devoted secretary. Um, I mean, the book is wonderful. I don't mean to overextend that portrayal, but the equality of her contributions, certainly to those of Engels, if not even greater contributions from Jenny Marx. She's one part of that. But the point that you were getting to, Stephen, is that if we really want to understand where works come from, we can't just look at the artist and who was he or she and whose name is on it, right? We have to look at the conditions of life within which the work was produced. And it's not just like, you know, Manchester capitalism, and this was the surrounding environment of Marx for so long and so forth. It's the household. You know, it's the beloved relationality that he had first with Jenny and then with his daughters, and the friendships. And so it is the conditions of life in industrial capitalism and the grinding poverty and the factory imagery. But it's also that Marx saw in his relationship with Jenny, and so did she, um, some of the ideals for the world they were fighting for, that they gave their lives to fighting for, that they committed their lives to a world of a totally different set of commitments in human relations. And they were experimenting with and experiencing with those relationships together. And Gabriel documents it very well. But I wanted to appreciate it in the same way that one would appreciate a co-author like Engels, because it seems to me impossible that not only would Marx not have written what he wrote, but also he wouldn't have thought the way that he did if it wasn't for the long life of experiences he had with Jenny. And I think all things are like that too. You know, I mean, like when we think about great music and when we think about great art and other authors who produce things that we love, the question of how did you do that? How did you come up with that? Well, it's something like this that I recount in the book. It's something like you would say, well, here I was. It was year X, and all around us was Y was happening. You know, and it's the entire context of life that gives rise to the thinking.
There's something interesting about how that is excluded a lot from political theory, because no one would bat an eye if you said you wrote a piece of music out of love, or if you wrote some poetry. But the idea, it almost seems like questionable to say like I developed this political theory out of love for a community or out of love for something. And I'm curious why or how that gets taken out of political theory. Is it because politics was supposed to be like rational and sort of analytical, and therefore we must expunge all this feeling stuff?
No, this is a wonderful question. It's a really important question because in the second chapter of the book, in a very careful way, I hope it's careful enough, I kind of blame Socrates for what happened here. In a way, I mean, not that I have to worry too much about blaming him um, without sufficient caution, but that. So here's what I think. Here's why I think it gets excluded. I mean, so to just go back for a minute to that part of the research. Plato's Symposium is a very strange book in the collected works of Plato's dialogues, because he clearly wanted us to hear a lot of other speeches than Socrates. I mean, it's all these other people speaking, not Socrates. And they're all attesting to this great power of love. Okay, they have different ways of thinking, but they're praising love as a god. And then actually the title of that part of my book is Too Many Aphrodites, because there's all these different ways that they think about love. But it's this very powerful thing. And according to Pausanias, it's a love that topples governments with regards to the regime of Hippias. And Aristophanes, has this whole completion theory of love where the people are split at birth and they look for their missing half, which many people have egregiously imputed to Socrates. They've wrongly said, many actually people who've written about love really in a very sloppy way have imputed to Socrates this idea of Aristophanes, the completion theory of love. But what's interesting about Plato's Symposium is that there's this whole expansive, I mean, it's a short text, but there's this very grandiose effort to praise love in various ways. And then Socrates blasts in finally, and he is so outraged he's very rarely this, he's usually Socrates is usually the guy who's characterized as, I don't know, what do you think? Well, I don't know, we'll figure it out as we go. But not in the Symposium. In the Symposium, he says, there's nothing I'm more confident about than the topic of love. And it's because he's gotten these lessons from Diotima. And then, so he gives this whole speech. And ultimately, there are some very interesting things in Socrates' view of love, no question, and some very important things too. But ultimately, Socrates and Diotima conclude that love is about immortality. So it's really ultimately about the sexual relations. There are some other aspects, of course, but the final word is about how we have love relations so as to live forever through our offspring, this procreative concept of love. And this, for me, has actually been one of the unfortunate legacies of the Symposium in the history of Western political thought. So when you ask the question of why it's excluded, I think part of the answer, not entirely, but part of the answer is because love has been reduced to the private affairs of a sexual relation. People who want to live together, who pair off, procreate, reproduce themselves in another human being, can get to immortality that way. And it sounds perhaps strange coming out of an ancient text, but if you look around, you see that this is still how most people think about love, in this very reductionist way, having to do with the romantic and sexual life of a very private, it's a private property of a sexual and romantic relation. You know, when people think of love, like you mentioned before jokingly, the rom-coms, like Love Actually, but it is in fact established as a part of the popular discourse on love that when we think and speak of love, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about two people who, if it's not so brazenly about immortality, fine, but two people who nonetheless, um, um, they do love, they make love as a private pair. And I think this is this is why, so when political theorists and political scientists think love, they think it's apolitical. They think it's outside of or parapolitical, or even, as Hannah Arendt insisted in The Human Condition, anti-political. So there's a reason, because it has to, because love is somehow an activity that has to do with this immaterial um, affection that, is materialized ultimately in a private sexual relationship.
But if we're stuck with this sort of, call it the Socrates Diotima rom-com version of love, where it's a privatized relationship between two people leading to sort of immortality and or sort of long-term benefit, that actually sounds less like love, more like investment.
Exactly. It's about it, yes, investment. And actually, even now, if you read some of the contemporary sociological literature on love, the late Zygmunt Bauman had some things on love, but the major sociological theorist who deals with the question of love is Eva Illouz. And a lot of it is still reduced to this Socrates and Diotima's. It's real. I mean, even Eva Illouz is egregiously focused not only on the romantic sexual relationship of a private household, but it's almost invariably heterosexual in Illouz's account, which is another problem of the image of love, the way that it's reduced, not just there, but further again down the line. And yeah, and it is problematic. Sometimes it comes from a conflation of love with desire, right? That people are mistaking sexual desire for love, but it's still pervasive. And some people have tried to break it apart, like Eric Fromm. In some ways, I would say that the book is an effort to really rework Fromm's original thesis, right? From the position of uh, uh, 21st century, the theoretical and political developments in between the 1950s and the present time. So that would include incorporating a lot more contemporary psychoanalytic theory um, and sociological literature. That would be one part of it. But Fromm was onto this, that love should not be understood that way. It should be understood not as the private property of a person you try to get love. And a lot of the more contemporary stuff still treats it as an investment. If I give you this much, I should get something else in return. And that, even in the smaller sphere of the sexual relationship between two, or as Alan Badiou calls the two scene, that's a great recipe for long-term resentment. If you have even, the theory that I'm writing, it's not that it has nothing at all to say about sexual relations. It does, because that's a part of it. But even there, in that space of sexual relationality, of the two scene that Badiou calls it, if one is always saying, but I'm the one who always washes the dishes, I'm the one who always does this, and I make more money than you. This is the way that exchange value disfigures human relations, right? I mean, this is it's an investment. I paid for it. Oh, I paid for the rent for the first 15 years or 10 years. At what point will you take over the financial burdens or at least contribute your fair share? And this kind of quantification of contributions is actually much more fitting for the factory than for the family or the friendship. Because again, I think even thinking about love in the context of a nuclear family, like two partners and children, that's already problematic. So we shouldn't do that. But in any case, I'm interested in thinking about love at the social level and not as an investment, but as a practice. And maybe I should say right now, before we go any further without it, the way that I define love is it's an activity that involves participating in the other's becoming what they are not yet. Right. So and I developed that out of Emmanuel Levinas and some other sources, but it's not like an imperialist participation where I would tell my children, here's what I want you to be, a doctor. And now I'm going to participate in your becoming a doctor. That's not what it is. It's a non-teleological participation in the other's becoming. And that would be a sort of small individualistic version of it, but it can also be theorized at a social level. What does love do at the social level? You could say is the beating heart of my main question.
I really like your discussion of relationship with your kid, which is in many ways sort of directly opposite to, let's call it, the Socrates Diotima version, where it's not about sort of how can I make them into little versions of me, but rather it's like, I don't know where this is going. And in fact, what's beautiful about it is sharing in that potentiality, sharing in the development without trying to necessarily know what it's going to be. And it reminds me of something that I've been working, I'm still working with Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. And one of the things they always talk about how is love is not about completion, it's about incompletion. It disturbs yourself, it moves you, it changes you. It doesn't sort of make you whole, it actually messes you up.
It's beautiful. Yes, I think that's very beautiful. And I mean, it's one of the problems with Aristophanes' completion theory. This idea that love should make us whole, is problematic because we don't know what that means. It's very difficult to define that as a goal.
Hmm. Yeah, I really like the discussion about your kids. Because I mean, even just in my life, I know that I find myself getting intrigued by and obsessed with things that I never cared about 5 years ago because it's shared with my son. And it's that sharing of the developing the potential and sharing, how one emerges as a person that actually changes one's experience. In a way, it kind of reminds me of Spinoza's ideas around affect, where affect is defined as both the capacity to affect and be affected in the world.
Yes.
Love both sort of, let's say, develops your sense of self, but also sort of how you can be affected positively and sometimes negatively by experiences of things around you.
Yes, this is real. I completely agree with this, and it's one of the reasons why I think we have to approach the Greco-Christian concept of agape very critically, because a part of that concept is charity. But really, I think if we understand love in the way that it has been understood best in the literature, it's not something you're doing solely for another person, right? That you're sort of, I'm investing in you, I'm giving you all of these things because I love you. It actually is something that has a kind of a collective value, and it does something also for the lover. It's not simply the benefit of the beloved. It's something that happens also to the lover at the same time. And you don't know where it's going to go. I actually really like what you said there about just with your son. You go with it and you do it. You practice love in real life, but you don't know where it's going to go. And I think today that this is precisely the position that communism is in. Is one of my previous books that of course, is Precarious Communism. is it's a non-teleological communism in the sense that we don't know for certain what communism will make, or where it will lead to in a kind of teleological sense. But we do know that the oppositional forces of communism are good because of what they oppose and what they do, what they consist in. So yeah, we don't know where it will go. And Simone Weil has a very beautiful point about this, where Simone Weil says that a part of the problem is loving another because of who you can imagine they might become. And it's a big problem it's a very basic problem of human relationality, especially outside of the family with other people, is that you say, I can imagine him or I can imagine her becoming this great person. I'm going to just love it when they get there. But but you don't know that they're going to end up where you would like them to. So what counts for Vey is loving the person as they are. As the way she puts it is, it's loving the other as such, right? Not as you imagine they could be.
Hmm.
And this undoes a lot of human relationality, is that when people finally realize, oh, you will never be who I thought you were going to become. And of course, too, it's true with children as well, that we have to, participating in the others becoming what they are not yet, not knowing what they may become, is actually very important for politics and life. Um, right? I mean, you don't know what they will become, but you love them as such.
At some point, I'll probably go and check on the questions in the chat box. But maybe one thing I want to ask more before I do that, and I sort of already kind of know, I suspect what you're going to say, but one thing I'm intrigued by when I read your work, and this is partially because it's quite different from my own approach, it is the way here you're deliberately you're not starting from arts or music or aesthetics.
Right.
And in fact, like, we don't get a jazz ensemble until page 41. There's basically like very few music or in most of the book, which is somewhat surprising um, in a book on love. But maybe that's sort of intentional. So I wanted to sort of ask you about that. Was it a sort of deliberate choice to sort of just like not focus on that because it was almost too obvious, or?
Well, that's a really great question, because you and I share, um, we share a lot of similar interests in art and music, and I, I agree that it could be an important part of this conversation. So, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say just is that I think it's maybe the best example is to think um, about things like that. I mean, just to put it more bluntly, is like, I mean, the music that I'm interested in, and a lot of the music in art that you're interested in, doesn't have a high exchange value, right? I mean, a lot of the music doesn't have a high exchange value. It's not that somebody pays a lot of money to hear it. It's more likely they may pay a lot of money not to hear it. I mean, it doesn't have a high exchange value, but it has a different value. And a part of what I'm trying to get at in this book is an appreciation of other values than exchange value, and to show the limits, or what I call in the subtitle of the book, the poverty of exchange value. I want to talk about all of the things that exchange value cannot properly value. So I carry around in my wallet a photograph for a passport picture of my late father, and it's worn and you can't even see his face anymore. If I put it on eBay, it would fetch no price. I mean, nobody would want it. It has no exchange value. You couldn't even tell it was a passport photo unless I told you that it was. And yet for me, it has a different value. And I like it there. I touch it sometimes. I look at it and I say, hi, Dad. It has a certain value, but it's a non-monetary value. It's not an exchange value. And so much of the arts, what you talk about, cannot be properly appreciated by capitalist exchange value. Particularly not when they're very creative and experimental and they don't already have built-in markets prepared to receive them, you know, whether we're talking about performances or commodities like recordings and paintings and things like that. So I actually completely agree that one of the best places to see other values than exchange value is to look at the world of art and music and other things like that. Why it's not a major part of the book is probably largely to do with the fact that I am engaging a certain set of literatures that for the most part ignore it. And I'm criticizing a lot of this literature and I'm building upon it in various ways. And some of the work of this book is a synthesis of stuff that's just not ever talked about in the same space. But a lot of this literature, possibly with the exception of Herbert Marcuse, is not very attentive to these questions. That's not really that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be asked, but I think maybe that it's that banal. Really, it's a kind of banal, but it is also, like you say, I mean, it's a difference of our approaches. I begin with the theoretical texts in a way, and in your work, something which I really appreciate is that a lot of the primary sources are different, right? I mean, you begin with the musician, you begin with, you know, Joe McPhee, or you begin, not always, because for you also it's a synthesis happening between, you know, textual and non-textual source material. But I think maybe it's also boils down to that. But certainly it's not a philosophical difference.
Part of what I was thinking, maybe I'm totally wrong on this, is I was thinking about your relationship with music as a sort of as a jazz or improv drummer, and how that mobilizes a different set of skills and capacities from your work as being a political scientist or a teacher. I'm almost thinking maybe there's some level in which you want to almost keep those skills outside of the world of work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have struggled with that a little bit, you know, is um, wanting to, I talk with my partner a lot about this. Robin and I talk about, you know, I would love to write about music and improvisation. I would love to do more with that. And she's always saying, you need to do more of that. You need to do more of that. But it has probably something to do. I don't know if it's that I don't want to connect them. I think I do want to connect them, actually. But somehow it feels to me that I don't know that I'm capable of it. Whereas I'm much more comfortable writing the types of books that I do write, even though I wasn't very comfortable writing this one until I was approaching its end.
Cool. Well, maybe with that as a thought, maybe I'll open up Pandora's box of the Q&A section and see what sort of things fly out here.
Okay.
Let's see what we got. Okay. Do you want me to read them, or do you want to read them, or how do you want to do that?
Well, we can. I don't mind looking at. I think maybe we see the same thing here. Yeah.
I think so. Yeah.
So how do you do it in order? Do you go from the bottom up, or do you go from the top down?
I think there's no rules here, man.
Okay.
You can do what you want.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to really, because I don't want to have for people who are watching this, I don't want you to watch me reading stuff.
Okay.
Right. I mean, because if people are watching me read stuff, but maybe I can just spot some things, and I'm not saying that that Marx is writing about love. He wrote the original books of poetry for Jenny, but they weren't really something that were meant to be published and distributed. So I think that Marx was not actually writing about the communism of love. I am writing about the communism of love. Marx is not writing about the communism of love. But what I see is that the way that Marx thinks about communism is something that we can find in our experiences of love. So let me give you an example. I'm talking to anonymous attendee, maybe also an anonymous attendee, but anonymous attendee. I think so. Let me give you an example. I'm not claiming that Marx is talking about is writing about the communism of love, but Marx says in a couple of places, also toward the end of his life, in the Critique of the Gotha program, that that on the great horizon, as everybody probably is familiar, of communism, of a new form of life, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And what I think is, if that is meant to indicate or to encapsulate, to some extent, what Marx thinks of when he thinks of communism, where in fact do you find from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs? I mean, I think that we find that in the materiality of our love relations. So when I talk about providing for my children's needs, and not expecting from dear friends, colleagues, and comrades things that they're not able to do because of other commitments or proclivities, right? It's from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. So it's kind of like a location where I think we can find communism in miniature. I don't rely theoretically on the Bolshevik Kollontai. I provide in the book a very serious critique of Kollontai, which I gave some passing indication of just before when I was talking about her carrying on the work that she did for the Soviet Union. And in that, I actually think practically abandoning what was her greatest contribution, which was her earlier writings about love. So I wouldn't take so much her professional life as something worth developing theoretically. I would take her early writings. Okay. And so, again, I don't want you to watch me reading, but
I kind of like
yeah.
this question here about
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate
sorry.
that.
So someone else asks, yes, so certainly a changed relation do not belong places that matter most to us. But what happens when they wind up there? Can capital change the nature of love? And that intrigued me, because I'm thinking of also your discussion of Valerie Solanas and her thing about how love is not possible in a society dominated by meaningless, pointless work. Increasingly today, we're sort of encouraged to do what we love, to sort of engage with work in a way which feels meaningful and fulfilling, and almost, we're seeking self-fulfillment through doing work, which at
Yes.
one level seems quite promising, but on another level can end up sort of just like taking that sort of dynamic or that sort of motivational structure or relationship that we like about something we love and bolting it onto accumulating profits for large companies and platforms and everyone. So it gets back to the sort of question that was asked about sort of how love is changed by capital, or what happens when it sort of, you take that bit that you kind of really like and then you sort of sprinkle it on sort of a bit of alienation.
Yeah, well. The discussion of Valerie Solanas in the book is a part of an effort to move away from generic and overgeneral discussions about love, because on the one hand, I'm trying to get at something like a universal communist aspiration, but on the other hand, one of the problems with a lot of philosophy of love is that it treats love as if it needs to do the same thing everywhere. It needs to do the same work everywhere. So the Solanas discussion is undertaken in chapter 5, which I call Love and White Supremacist Capitalist Patriarchy. So there's quite a lot of attention in this book to how love needs to do different work, and in fact does do different work in different contexts of sexuality, gender, and race, and that Marx is really insufficient on his own for capturing, or for you can't build a good theory of love today on the writings of Marx alone. You need to bring in a lot of these other resources. So Solanus is in this chapter 5, Love and White Supremacist Capitalist Patriarchy, because Solanus, she had no home in a way, right? I mean, she was on the streets in California. She was expelled. She wasn't accepted by feminists. She wasn't accepted by other radical groups. She wasn't accepted by the artists who she tried, and she had considerable talents. And she was queer, and she was a radical anti-capitalist with incredibly with incredibly formidable talents as a writer and a playwright. So what ended up happening is part of it is biographical, but another part of it is, that we need to find some ways of. I mean, it's very. There's a lot of sadness in the case of Solanus, because I think that it makes sense why she shot Andy Warhol, because she knew how talented she was, and she was blockaded, expelled, and feminists don't take her up as they should. They're afraid that it will make feminist theory look irrational. But when you get down into something like the Scum Manifesto and look at what she's saying about work and sexuality, and you look at what she's saying about gender and patriarchy, it's extremely important. It's written in a way that theorists do not, and political scientists and social scientists, and even people, academics in the humanities, don't want to read Solanus, because they don't want to recognize, the importance of the argument she's making when they're written that way. But that same fate befalls also Bell Hooks, because Bell Hooks writes not like Solanus, but she's talked about this with Cornel West in a book called Breaking Bread, about the way that she writes as a Black radical woman being totally marginalized in the social sciences and humanities. Even though she's not a marginal figure, she's a hugely influential public intellectual. Hooks has written a whole quartet of books on the subject of love, and the major sociological literature on love do not mention her at all, right? Because it's not considered empirically grounded enough. It's too much of like cultural observation, not enough, not enough empirical research, or whatever they think. They do not take up her work. So what I'm trying to do is to with Solanus is I'm trying to say, let's try to appreciate some of the contributions to thinking about love, or ultimately some of the contributions to a theory of love that academics who've written about love up to this point have completely ignored, to their own detriment. Like, the theory of love is worse without Solanus. The theory of love is worse without Hooks. A good theory of love needs to pull in some of these disparate, marginalized, misfit histories and materials. And so that's what I'm trying to do there with Solanus. And in that section also, where I work with Tommy J. Curry's, look, if you and I, Stephen, we talk about raising our kids. But Tommy J. Curry, who wrote a wonderful book a couple of years ago called The Man Not, he talked about how young Black boys in America, by the age of my older son, who's in middle school now, walk around in the United States with a carceral consciousness, because they're already aware, as young boys, they're already aware of the lopsided likelihood that their bodies will be imprisoned. And so when you live in a society that is full of racial profiling, police brutality, that is a white supremacist society, something which we now have more evidence for in the United States, at least, than we could wish for. we have to understand that when people of color think about love by beginning with how they relate to their children, love has different work to do there, right? It's different. Love doesn't do the same thing for everyone. It mustn't do the same thing for everyone. It must do different things. It must be a materiality of love. It must take place within the material conditions in the context of life. So many of the theorists of love, just for example, they say you cannot, I mean, this is like a Hallmark card. You cannot love anyone else until you love yourself. But if you live in a white supremacist society where the images of other people of color, other black boys and other black men are so are nothing more than racist caricatures and vilifications, the work that love has to do there in the black community is different, right? I mean, if if there, if it doesn't do the same thing there, and also it doesn't do the same thing on issues of sexuality, because if you participate in the other's becoming, we can think about Felix Guattari's Becoming Woman. We can think about transgender politics, right? And so, what kind of work does love do? Um, Not just in the world of cisgender heterosexual parenting, but in the world of transgender politics, and also in a world of raising up young boys and young girls of color in a white supremacist patriarchal society. Love must do different things in different places because it's a real active practice that takes place within the material conditions of life.
I think you might say that there has to be sort of almost like a base level of like reaffirmation of like value of worth of life before you could talk about like, are you loving the right way? No, it's almost like you have to affirm that you don't have to necessarily always be in fear just to walk down the street. I mean, and that's what you sounds like you're saying is just taken away. And once you have that taken away, how can you actually engage in a loving relationship because you've had that almost robbed from you? There's like sort of like basic little processes that have to happen before. Yeah, I'm not getting it totally right here, but yeah, I think I know what you mean. Hopefully,
It's something I think that actually emerges out of experiences and relationships, and a lot of times, as Bell Hooks points out, one doesn't have those experiences, relationships until they flee the home, because the home is sometimes not a space of love but a space of abuse. And so when we speak of children, also again here this is another reason why we must not make a generic um, we must not make the theory of love do generic work as if everyone's life is the same. It if you live in an abusive home, sometimes the experience of love relations doesn't happen until you leave the home, and you can find them outside of the home.
there's this question here I kind of want to read, but I kind of don't want to read the whole thing because it's kind of bloody long. It starts off asking something about Hegel, but then goes in asking about how your theory of love relates to the way that Hannah talks about love in terms of recognition.
Okay. Yes. Thank you for that question, and thank you, Stephen, for reading it. It probably we should have talked about, like, when you're talking, I'll read questions, and when I'm talking, you'll read questions, because otherwise it's just a video of us reading questions. Haneth is a pretty big part of the chapter on critical theory. So chapter 4, Love as Practice, Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis. Um, there is something too with Hegel, because Hegel wrote about Sittlichkeit, which for Hegel, Sittlichkeit was about the ethical obligation that each of us has to other people. Um, and it was something that had to be active, not like a private morality, but it had to be externalized as a set of active commitments, political commitments. So it was Sittlichkeit that turned Hegel into a kind of a political pamphleteer when he wrote "The magistrates should be elected by the people." So I think you can find some pre-sentiments of this externalization right? In terms of active commitments, also in Hegel. But Hanneth, Hanneth, I think is in some ways great, because he does talk about socialism not as an institutional top-down. He's got this book, somewhat recent book called The Idea of Socialism, where he talks about socialism in terms of bottom-up social relationality, or he talks about socialism in terms of human relations. And that's what you might expect from a good critical theorist. But the problem is he's very fragmentary in terms of his attention to the question of love. He does mention Fromm here and there, but you would think Hanneth, as a critical theorist, would maybe have done a little bit more, especially with his reconceiving of socialism as a set of relations, bottom up kind of ways of relating, as opposed to statist top down institutional initiatives. And so I draw on Hanneth a little bit for his theory of recognition, seeing the other in a healthy way that participates in their healthy development. That is for me very clearly a part of the theory of love. But really, unfortunately, critical theory after Fromm and Marcuse, in my view, dropped the question of love, and shouldn't have. But it needs to be taken up. And as Stephen, as you mentioned, like a little while ago, like others have tried to do that, like Hart and Negri and Commonwealth and Assembly. They have spoken in fragmentary ways about communist love in the way that I want to do, but they haven't produced a cohesive study on the communism of love. It really appears mostly in these rather stunted fragments, but I like what they have to say about it. I think it points in the right direction.
How much do you want to bet that's Michael writing it and Tony going, "Stop that, Michael, stop it"?
Yeah, right. I think that's pretty safe. I mean, Hart has actually gone off and given some lectures on the topic of love without Tony. So yeah, I think that's probably fair to say.
There's a question here from Mitchell asking for about basically definition questions, but the way it's written, I'm gonna bet this is probably Mitchell Verder. So I'm gonna say, I love you, Mitchell. You're great. But I think we already sort of answered that partially. So you answered. I just sat here and scratched my beard. The one question here I like here. I'll read this out. How can we think about the revolutionary power of love at relations of societal level? Can these relations only exist between lovers, families, and communities? How does this threaten capitalism? So I think what this asking is a question about almost like how the sort of, might call it the micro-communism of love, scales up, or does it scale up, or is it just create little like oases where we can like, make life more habitable in small spaces, but doesn't actually grow beyond that?
It's a very, very good question. Thank you for finding it there, Stephen, and thank you for asking it. It's a very good question, because if we can come to a point where we can see the communism of love, the next question is how to mobilize any kind of politics out of that. And here, I think it's very difficult to answer the question. I don't think that a philosophy can really help too much with it, because love happens here or there in one way or another way. What I hope a philosophy can do there is it can show us how much we rely upon and demand communism in our own lives. So I say at one point in the book that the best things under capitalism are the least capitalist things. The best things under capitalism are the least capitalist things. Now, most people, I think, can understand that if they think about it. But then the question is, how do you externalize that into some kind of a politics? How do you scale up? There is a section in the book where I try to think about that, and it's tentative, but I am trying. I wrote a book previous to the Communism of Love called Specters of Revolt, which focused on uprisings, riot and rebellion, insurrection, and there's this chapter of the Communism of Love called Unalienation. And in the chapter on unalienation, there is a whole lot of attention on George Katsiofikis and the Eros effect, right? So Katsiofikis is trying to think about his teacher Marcuse's theory of Eros in terms of social movements, uprisings, and rebellions. And um, one of the things that I think scales up the the communism of love in the miniature that we have been discussing are social upheavals and revolts and uprisings, and the way that people express not only their disaffection in social upheavals and uprisings and revolts, but they actually express their affections, right? And so if you take a look at some of the primary sources that come out of major global uprisings in the last 20 years, they're often discussed as ecstatic um, uh, social gatherings, ecstatic social gatherings where people break with the privatization of everyday life, not just the privatization of life at work, but the privatization of life in the household, and provide point of contacts to congregate with other human beings, express disaffection and also express affection, right? And make connections to other human beings that in that context are materialized in revolts. So, so in all of my work, I am really going back to the beginning. I have always preferred to think of politics from below. You know, I mean, a lot of people, when they think about Marx, they think about Stalin, or they think about top down. They think about they don't think about Marx the way that I think about Marx. They don't think about Marx from the point of view, I would say, not just of an autonomous Marxist, but they don't think about Marx from the point of view of Marx, right? Who was thinking about the Gemeinwesen. He was thinking about social relations and human relations and alienation and counteracting the individuation. Marx writes in the Grundrisse that humans now carry their social bond around in their wallet. The humans carry their social bond with them in their pocket. It's money. But the non-monetary relation of these explosive moments of upheaval, which we saw in the last several years, not just when you talk about, I mean, I've written extensively on the Zapatistas, but we've also seen many other formations of social upheaval and revolt with Occupy, with the Arab Spring, more recently with the uprisings in Hong Kong, with you know, obviously Egypt and Tahrir Square, but also Gezi Park and Taksim Square in Turkey. We've seen a whole wave of upheavals in Argentina and also in France with Gilets jaunes, and now newly renewed upheavals that are, sometimes people in the Western media say, well, if they oppose Macron, they must be conservative. But it's not true if you go and look and see what's going on. So I think that to some extent, I agree with Katsiofikis that one of the ways that we expand and practice the communism of love beyond the privacy of a family or a small unit at the social level, which the question was asking, is in moments of upheaval and moments of revolt, which give people an experience with other people, right? And Marina Citrin and Dario Azzolini have written about the horizontalidad, the way that these relations, the real relations of people in a revolt, are really experiments with different forms of being in the world, different ways of being in the world. And so it's not a silver bullet, right? It's not like the communism of love can be scaled up. It's kind of like when Felix Guattari asked, can all these little micro revolutions one day be really revolutionary? You know, like he was thinking, he said, Guattari said, there will be no more October revolutions. So the question is for Guattari is, can all these micro revolutions one day become really revolutionary? Right? So Guattari understood that they were not revolutionary yet. To say, will they become really revolutionary is the same thing as to say they are not now. And so this is in some way the same question of the communism of love. Can they become really revolutionary?
Um, Maybe I'll just ask one more thing. I think maybe as a way to sort of get towards something not like a conclusion, but a sort of pause. I really tried to avoid asking anything about COVID because, yeah. But I am sort of curious to what extent, you know, the past 8 months or this year, we're all of a sudden now being with others, at least over here in England, is just completely half forgotten experience, right? Is there something about the present that where there's a particular value of reclaiming or re-theorizing the value of love and its communist potential now, and where could that take us?
I think that's a very good question to draw to a close on. It's been almost an hour and a half, so we might want to do that. And that's a really good question. And I do apologize. I'm not reading all of the questions while we're doing this live, but I would be happy to discuss anything further with people if you want to get in touch, or preferably take a look at the book, because and see what you think of the book. And then, but either way is fine. But I hope I'm not talking out of school by saying this. But AK Press did ask me if I might write a kind of afterword on COVID, since the book was actually written before COVID-19, but it was published last week, actually. So, so I did write a COVID coda, or a coronavirus coda, and I became kind of attached to that afterthought of where you think of the communism of love in relation to COVID. But one of the things that we didn't put it in the book, it's not in the book, because one of the things that was said by AK Press was it was not really thinking beyond the virus. It was a coda that was thinking about the communism of love right now, but it would have been better to have something that was like after COVID. And that in some ways is a good way for me to answer that, because it's very hard to think about where we're going to go in terms of our basic human relationality and the sociality of the world, right? Given the current experience of global pandemic. I don't think these are just temporary alienations that will be restored when everyone is vaccinated. I don't believe that. I think it's kind of like in the United States, the Department of Labor was the purview of immigration for a very long time. Immigration belonged to the Department of Labor. But in the context of the war, it was temporarily moved to the Department of Justice. But guess what? That's still where it is. It's immigration is an ICE. We're not supposed to be looking at we're looking at people coming into the country at the border from the question of national security. It was a labor issue. But once you establish a certain way of doing things that is to the benefit of people in positions of power, it's very difficult to go back. So just one thing about online learning and education, my university has been trying to get everyone to go online for 15 years. And I sometimes jokingly say, I wonder if the deans and administrators at the university are behind COVID-19 because that finally they got us all to go online. And it's a really dangerous thing if we don't go back, at least to the previous existing reality that not so long ago we wanted to abolish. You know, I'd like to get back to the earlier state of affairs that had to be abolished. But right now, we have seen the exacerbation of the worst things under capitalism. So what I think COVID-19 has done for many people around the world, and of course here there are questions of class and globality, because when people say we're all in this together, it's not quite right, because we live in stratified societies and it does different things to different people. And there's also a racial dimension of the virus, and that has to be addressed as well. But alienation was a problem. You know, um, Alan Ehrenberg wrote The Weariness of the Self. Franco Berardi's been writing about alienation and isolation. Bernard Stiegler, the great late Stiegler, who we lost this year, he wrote extensively about these subjects of human isolation and alienation. And Marx wrote about alienation, and Fromm wrote about alienation. And other problems of capitalism, for example, needing to exchange work for money, needing to exchange work so that you could acquire the basic necessities of life, not just money, but money for food, money for rent, the ability to go to school, the ability to get health care if you're sick. So all of these are old problems of capitalism. But COVID-19 has taken the problems of capitalist society and exacerbated them in ways that I'm afraid we will not fully be able to appreciate for a long, long time. You know, and when you talk about the communism of love being absent in some households because there's spaces of abuse, we have to think about the young children and the partners who are victims of abuse, whose only refuge used to be leaving the house, and now they cannot do it. So the toll is not, I mean, when you think about this in capitalist terms, you think about it poorly. You think about what is happening to your favorite businesses. You think about the economic carnage. And of course, that's true. And you think about the loss of life. Of course, you think about the loss of life. But there's also a whole psychosocial dimension of a global pandemic. And it's a rearrangement and an exacerbation that brings anxiety to its breaking point. And when you talk about precarity and insecurity, I'm sorry to say that our experience right now has taken those old theses and strengthened them. The flip side, Stephen, I would hope, is that maybe we can now see some things that we used to have to make the case for, that we used to hope that people would maybe have an epiphanous moment and see the complete insanity. As Fromm wrote about this in The Sane Society, he wrote that capitalism was insane. And others like Deleuze and Guattari have written about the insanity of capitalism. Capitalism, a very special delirium, was the way that it was put by Deleuze and Guattari. And Fromm, in a very different register, also talked about capitalist insanity. But those used to be things that we had to work very hard to get those epiphanies about the insanity of a world organized by the logic of capital, right? Maybe COVID-19 is maybe the upside, and I don't claim this because I don't know it yet. It's too soon, I think. But maybe the upside of all of the exacerbated alienation and the other carnage, economic and in terms of human life, maybe the upside is that we will be able to see the importance of the necessity of a totally different way of organizing social relations. Because if you have a job and that's the way you eat, if you have a job and that's how you pay your rent, And now here in the United States, 1 in 6 families with children don't have enough food to eat a meal every single day, right? I mean, it's catastrophic. So people who studied ecology have known for a long time that, I mean, this goes back to James O'Connor and natural causes and capitalism, nature, socialism. And we see with the climate movement and Greta Thunberg and others that people are talking about the insanity of the existing state of affairs. But I think it's maybe been generalized now that people's direct experience is much closer in touch with the insanity of a world in which if you can't work, if you can't work for an employer, if you can exchange your labor for a wage, you have absolutely no security of health and well-being in a capitalist society. And alienation is to the breaking point. So I can't be positive about it, Stephen, but my hope is that an experience like this one in the spirit of Marxian crisis theory will create the space for us to see that we really need something else. And what's great is we don't actually have to look too far to find it. Just look at the relationships that make our lives worth living. And if they're not in your house, then they're outside of your house with comrades and colleagues and friends. And the relationships that make our lives living are not governed by the logic of capital. They're governed by a different logic, and that is the logic we need.
I feel like it's the point where I should be like, roll the theme tune.
A love supreme. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Stephen.